Section 11 of Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by J. Martin. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 11, Chapters 51 through 56. Chapter 51. After we had been one day in Italy, the Count Galetto della Mirandola joined us. He was traveling by post and stopping where we were. He told me that I had done wrong to leave France. I ought not to journey forward, for if I returned at once, my affairs would be more prosperous than ever. On the other hand, if I persisted in my course, I was giving the game up to my enemies and furnishing them with opportunities to do me mischief. By returning, I might put a stop to their intrigues, and those in whom I placed the most confidence were just the men who played most traitorously. He would not say more than that he knew very well all about it, and indeed, the Cardinal of Ferrara had now conspired with the two rogues I left in charge of all my business. Having repeated over and over again that I ought absolutely to turn back, he went onward with the post, while I, being influenced by my companions, could not make my mind up to return. My heart was sorely torn asunder, at one moment by the desire to reach Florence as quickly as I could, and at another by the conviction that I ought to regain France. At last, in order to end the fever of this irresolution, I determined to take the post for Florence. I could not make arrangements with the first postmaster, but persisted in my purpose to travel forward and endure an anxious life at Florence. I parted company with Signor Ippolito Gangazza, who took the route for Mirandola, while I diverged upon the road to Parma and Pazienza. In the latter city I met Duke Pier Luigi upon the street, who stared me in the face and recognized me. Since I knew him to have been the sole cause of my imprisonment in the castle of St. Angelo, the sight of him made my blood boil. Yet being unable to escape from the man, I decided to pay him my respects, and arrived just after he had risen from table in the company of the Landi, who afterwards murdered him. On my appearance he received me with unbounded marks of esteem and affection, among which he took occasion to remark to the gentlemen present that I was the first artist of the world in my own line, and that I had been for a long while in prison at Rome. Then he turned to me and said, "My Benvenuto, I was deeply grieved by your misfortune, and knew well that you were innocent, but could not do anything to help you. In short, it was my father who chose to gratify some enemies of yours, from whom, moreover, he heard that you had spoken ill of him. I am convinced this was not true, and indeed I was heartily sorry for your troubles." These words he kept piling up and repeating until he seemed to be begging my pardon. Afterwards he inquired about the work I had been doing for his most Christian Majesty, and on my furnishing him with details, he listened as attentively and graciously as possible. Then he asked if I had a mind to serve him. To this I replied that my honor would not allow me to do so, but that if I had completed those extensive works begun for the king, I should be disposed to quit any great prince merely to enter his excellency's service. Hereby it may be seen how the power and goodness of God never leave unpunished any sort or quality of men who act unjustly toward the innocent. This man did what was equivalent to begging my pardon in the presence of those very persons whom subsequently took revenge on him for me and many others whom he had massacred. Let then no prince, however great he be, laugh at God's justice in the way that many whom I know are doing, and who have cruelly maltreated me, as I shall relate at the proper time. I do not write these things in any worldly spirit of boasting, but only to return thanks to God, my deliverer, in so many trials. In those, too, which daily assail me, I always carry my complaint to him and call on him to be my defender. On all occasions, after I have done my best to aid myself, if I lose courage and my feeble forces fail, Then is the great might of God manifested, which descends unexpectedly on those who wrongfully injure their neighbors, or neglect the grave and honorable charge they have received from him. Chapter 52. When I returned to my inn, I found that the Duke had sent me abundance to eat and drink of very excellent quality. I made a hearty meal, then mounted and rode toward Florence. There I found my sister with 6 daughters, the eldest of whom was marriageable, and the youngest still at nurse. Her husband, by reason of divers circumstances in the city, had lost employment from his trade. I had sent gems and French jewelry more than a year earlier, to the amount of about 2,000 ducats, and now brought with me the same wares to the value of about 1,000 crowns. I discovered that, whereas I made them an allowance of 4 golden crowns a month, they always drew considerable sums from the current sale of these articles. My brother-in-law was such an honest fellow that, fearing to give me cause for anger, he had pawned nearly everything he possessed, and was devoured by interest, in his anxiety to leave my moneys untouched. It seems that my allowance, made by way of charity, did not suffice for the needs of the family. When then I found him so honest in his dealing, I felt inclined to raise his pension, and it was my intention, before leaving Florence, to make some arrangement for all of his daughters. Chapter 53. The Duke of Florence, at this time, which was the month of August 1545, had retired to Poggio a Cano, 10 miles distant from Florence. Thither, then, I went to pay him my respects, with the sole object of acting as duty required, first because I was a Florentine, and next because my forefathers had always been adherents of the Medicean party, and I yielded to none of them in affection for this Duke Cosimo. As I have said, then, I rode to Poggio with the sole object of paying my respects, and with no intention of accepting service under him, as God, who does all things well, did then appoint for me. When I was introduced, the Duke received me very kindly. Then he and the Duchess put questions concerning the works which I had executed for the king. I answered willingly and in detail. After listening to my story, he answered that he had heard as much, and that I spoke the truth. Then he assumed a tone of sympathy and added, "How small a recompense for such great and noble masterpieces! Friend Benvenuto, if you feel inclined to execute something for me too, I am ready to pay you far better than that king of yours has done, for whom your excellent nature prompts you to speak so gratefully." When I understood his drift, I described the deep obligations under which I lay to his Majesty, who first obtained my liberation from that iniquitous prison, and afterwards supplied me with the means of carrying out more admirable works than any artist of my quality had ever had the chance to do. While I was thus speaking, my lord the Duke writhed in his chair, and seemed as though he could not bear to hear me to the end. Then, when I had concluded, he rejoined, "If you are disposed to work for me, I will treat you in a way that will astonish you, provided the fruits of your labors give me satisfaction, of which I have no doubt." I, poor unhappy mortal, burning with desire to show the noble school of Florence that, after leaving her in youth, I had practiced other branches of the art than she imagined, gave answer to the Duke that I would willingly erect for him in marble or in bronze a mighty statue on his fine piazza. He replied that, for a first essay, he should like me to produce a Perseus. He had long set his heart on having such a monument, and he begged me to begin a model for the same. I very gladly set myself to the task, and in a few weeks I finished my model, which was about a cubit high, in yellow wax, and very delicately finished in all its details. I had made it with the most thorough study in art. The Duke returned to Florence, but several days passed before I had an opportunity of showing my model. It seemed, indeed, as though he had never set eyes on me or spoken to me, and this caused me to augur ill of my future dealings with His Excellency. Later on, however, one day after dinner, I took it to his wardrobe, where he came to inspect it with the Duchess and a few gentlemen of the court. No sooner had he seen it than he expressed much pleasure and extolled it to the skies, wherefrom I gathered some hope that he might really be a connoisseur of art. After having well considered it for some time, always with greater satisfaction, he began as follows. If you could only execute this little model, Benvenuto, with the same perfection on a large scale, it would be the finest piece in the piazza. I replied, Most excellent, my lord. Upon the piazza are now standing works by the great Donatello and the incomparable Michelangelo, the two greatest men who have ever lived since the days of the ancients. But since your excellence encourages my model with such praise, I feel the heart to execute it at least thrice as well in bronze. No slight dispute arose upon this declaration, the Duke protesting that he understood these matters perfectly and was quite aware what could be done. I rejoined that my achievements would resolve his disputations and debates. I was absolutely sure of being able to perform far more than I had promised for His Excellency, but that he must give me means for carrying my work out, else I could not fulfill my undertaking. In return for this, His Excellency bade me formulate my demands in a petition detailing all my requirements. He would see them liberally attended to. It is certain that if I had been cunning enough to secure by contract all I wanted for my work, I should not have incurred the great troubles which came upon me through my own fault. But he showed the strongest desire to have the work done and the most perfect willingness to arrange preliminaries. I, therefore, not discerning that he was more a merchant than a duke, dealt very frankly with His Excellency, just as if I had to do with a prince and not with a commercial man. I sent in my petition, to which he replied in large and ample terms. The memorandum ran as follows. Most rare and excellent my patron, petitions of any validity and compacts between us of any value do not rest upon words or writings. The whole point is that I should succeed in my work according to my promise, and if I so succeed, I feel convicted that your most illustrious Excellency will very well remember what you have engaged to do for me. This language so charmed the Duke, both with my ways of acting and of speaking, that he and the Duchess began to treat me with extraordinary marks of favor. Chapter 54. Being now inflamed with a great desire to begin working, I told His Excellency that I had need of a house where I could install myself and erect furnaces, in order to commence operation in clay and bronze, and also according to their separate requirements in gold and silver. I knew that he was well aware how thoroughly I could serve him in those several branches, and I required some dwelling fitted for my business. In order that His Excellency might perceive how earnestly I wished to work for him, I had already chosen a convenient house in a quarter much to my liking. As I did not want to trench upon His Excellency for money or anything of that sort, I had brought with me from France 2 jewels, with which I begged him to purchase me the house, and to keep them until I earned it with my labor. These jewels were excellently executed by my workmen after my own designs. When he had inspected them with minute attention, he uttered these spirited words, which clothed my soul with a false hope. "Take back your jewels, Benvenuto. I want you and not them. You shall have your house free of charges." After this, he signed a rescript underneath the petition I had drawn up, and which I have always preserved among my papers. The rescript ran as follows. Let the house be seen to, and who is the vendor, and at what price, for we wish to comply with Benvenuto's request. I naturally thought that this would secure me in possession of the house, being over and above convinced that my performances must far exceed what I promised. His Excellency committed the execution of these orders to his majordomo, who was named Ser Pier Francesco Ricocchio. The man came from Prato and had been the Duke's pedagogue. I talked then to this donkey and described my requirements, for there was a garden adjoining the house on which I wanted to erect a workshop. He handed the matter over to a paymaster, dry and meagre, who bore the name of Lattanzio Gorini. This flimsy little fellow, with his tiny spider's hands and small gnat's voice, moved about the business at a snail's pace. Yet in an evil hour he sent me stones, sand, and lime enough to build perhaps a pigeon house with careful management. When I saw how coldly things were going forward, I began to feel dismayed. However, I said to myself, little beginnings sometimes have great endings, and I fostered hope in my heart by noticing how many thousand ducats had recently been squandered upon ugly pieces of bad sculpture turned out by that beast of a Boccaccio Bandinelli. So I rallied my spirits and kept prodding Lattanzio Guarini to make him go a little faster. It was like shouting to a pack of lame donkeys with a blind dwarf for their driver. Under these difficulties, and by the use of my own money, I had soon marked out the foundations of the workshop and cleared the ground of trees and vines, laboring on, according to my wont, with fire and perhaps a trifle impatience. On the other side, I was in the hands of Tasso the carpenter, a great friend of mine, who had received my instructions for making a wooden framework to set up the Perseus. This Tasso was a most excellent craftsman, the best, I believe, who ever lived in his own branch of art. Personally, he was gay and merry by temperament, and whenever I went to see him, he met me laughing, with some little song in falsetto on his lips. Half in despair, as I then was, news coming that my affairs in France were going worse, and these in Florence promising but ill through the lukewarmness of my patron, I could never stop listening till half the song was finished, and so in the end I used to cheer up a little with my friend, and drove away as well as I was able some of the gloomy thoughts which weighed upon me. Chapter 55. I had got all the above-mentioned things in order, and was making vigorous preparations for my great undertaking. Indeed, a portion of the lime had already been used, when I received sudden notice to appear before the major domo. I found him after His Excellency's dinner in the hall of the clock. On entering, I paid him marked respect, and he received me with the greatest stiffness. Then he asked who had installed me in the house, and by whose authority I had begun to build there, saying he marveled much that I had been so headstrong and foolhardy. I answered that I had been installed in the house by His Excellency, and that his lordship himself, in the name of His Excellency, had given the orders to Lattanzio Guarini. Lattanzio brought stone, sand, and lime, and provided me what I wanted, saying he did so at your lordship's desires. When I had thus spoken, the brute turned upon me with still greater tartness, vowing that neither I nor any of those whom I had mentioned spoke the truth. This stung me to the quick, and I exclaimed, "O major domo, so long as your lordship chooses to use language benefiting the high office which you hold, I shall revere you, and speak to you as respectfully as I do the Duke. If you take another line with me, I shall address you as but one Sir Pier Francisco Recount." He flew into such a rage that I thought he meant to go mad upon the spot, anticipating the time ordered by heaven for him to do so. Pouring forth a torrent of abuse, he roared out that he was surprised at himself for having let me speak at all to a man of his quality. Thereupon my blood was up, and I cried, "Mark my words then, Sir Pier Francesco Recount. I tell you what sort of men are my equals, and who are yours, mere teachers of the alphabet to children." His face contracted with a spasm, while he raised his voice and repeated the same words in a still more insulting tone. I, too, assumed an air of menace, and matching his own arrogance with something of the same sort, I told him plainly that men of my kind were worthy to converse with popes and emperors and great kings, and that perhaps there were not 2 such men alive upon this earth, while 10 of his sort might be men at every doorway. On hearing these words, he jumped upon a window-seat in the hall there, and defied me to repeat what I had said. I did so with still greater heat and spirit, adding, I had no further mind to serve the Duke, and that I should return to France, where I was always welcome. The brute remained there stupefied and pale as clay. I went off furious, resolved on leaving Florence, and would to God that I had done so. The Duke cannot, I think, have been informed at once of this diabolical scene, for I waited several days without hearing from him. Giving up all thoughts of Florence except what concerned the settlement of my sister and niece's affairs, I made preparations to provide for them as well as I could with the small amount of money I had brought, and then to return to France and never set my foot in Italy again. This being my firm purpose, I had no intention to ask leave of the Duke or anybody, but to decamp as quickly as I could, when one morning the major domo, of his own accord, and open a long pedantic oration in which I could discover neither method, nor elegance, nor meaning, nor head, nor tail. I only gathered from it that he professed himself a good Christian, wished to bear no man malice, and asked me in the Duke's name what salary I should be willing to accept. Hearing this, I stood a while on guard and made no answer, being firmly resolved not to engage myself. When he saw that I refused to reply, he had at least the cleverness to put in, "Benvenuto, dukes expect to be answered, and what I am saying to you, I am saying from His Excellency's lips." Then I rejoined that if the message came from His Excellency, I would gladly reply, and told him to report to the Duke that I could not accept a position inferior to that of anyone employed by him as an artist. The major domo answered, "Bandolino receives 200 crowns a year. If, then, you are contented with that, your salary is settled." I agreed upon these terms, adding that what I might earn in addition by the merit of my performances could be given after they were seen. That point I left entirely to the good judgment of His Excellency. Thus, then, against my will, I pieced the broken thread again and set to work, the Duke continually treating me with the highest imaginable marks of favor. Chapter 56. I received frequent letters from France written by my most faithful friend, Messer Guido Guidi. As yet they told nothing but good news, and Ascanio also bade me enjoy myself without uneasiness, since, if anything happened, he would let me know at once. Now the king was informed that I had commenced working for the Duke of Florence, and being the best man in the world, he often asked, "Why does not Benvenuto come back to us?" He put searching questions on the subject to my 2 workmen, both of whom replied that I kept writing I was well off where I was, adding they thought I did not want to re-enter the service of His Majesty. Incensed by these presumptuous words, which were none of my saying, the king exclaimed, "Since he left us without any cause, I will not recall him. Let him even stay where he is." Thus the thievish brigands brought matters exactly to the pass they desired, for if I had returned to France, they would have become mere workmen under me once more, whereas, while I remained away, they were their own masters and in my place. Consequently, they did everything in their power to prevent my coming back. End of section 11.
12 of Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 12, Chapters 57 through 62. Chapter 57. While the workshop for executing my Perseus was in building, I used to work in a ground-floor room. Here I modelled the statue in plaster, giving it the same dimensions as the bronze was meant to have, and intending to cast it from this mould. But finding that it would take rather long to carry it out in this way, I resolved upon another expedient, especially as now a wretched little studio had been erected, brick on brick, so miserably built that the mere recollection of it gives me pain. So then I began the figure of Medusa, and constructed the skeleton in iron. Afterwards I put on the clay, and when that was modelled, baked it. I had no assistants except some little shop-boys, among whom was one of great beauty. He was the son of a prostitute called La Gambetta. I made use of the lad as a model, for the only books which teach this art are the natural human body. Meanwhile, as I could not do everything alone, I looked about for workmen in order to put the business quickly through, but I was unable to find any. There were indeed some in Florence who would willingly have come, but Bandinello prevented them, and after keeping me in want of aid a while, told the Duke that I was trying to entice his work-people because I was quite incapable of setting up so great a statue by myself. I complained to the Duke of the annoyance which the brute gave me, and begged him to allow me some of the labourers from the opera. My request inclined him to lend ear to Bandinello's calumnies, and when I noticed that, I set about to do my utmost by myself alone. The labour was enormous. I had to strain every muscle night and day, and just then the husband of my sister sickened and died after a few days' illness. He left my sister, still young, with 6 girls of all ages on my hands. This was the first great trial I endured in Florence, to be made the father and guardian of such a distressed family. Chapter 58. In my anxiety that nothing should go wrong, I sent for 2 hand-labourers to clear my garden of rubbish. They came from Ponte Vecchio, the one an old man of 60 years, the other a young fellow of 18. After employing them about 3 days, the lad told me that the old man would not work, and that I had better send him away, since beside being idle, he prevented his comrade from working. The little I had to do there could be done by himself, without throwing money away on other people. The youth was called Bernardino Manilini of Mugello. When I saw that he was so inclined to labour, I asked whether he would enter my service, and we agreed upon the spot. He groomed my horse, gardened, and soon essayed to help me in the workshop, with such success that by degrees he learned the art quite nicely. I never had a better assistant than he proved. Having made up my mind to accomplish the whole affair with this man's aid, I now let the Duke know that Bandinello was lying, and that I could get on famously without his work-people. Just at this time I suffered slightly in the loins, and being unable to work hard, I was glad to pass my time in the Duke's wardrobe with a couple of young goldsmiths called Gian Pagolo and Domenico Poggini, who made a little golden cup under my direction. It was chased in bas-relief with figures and other pretty ornaments, and His Excellency meant it for the Duchess to drink water out of. He furthermore commissioned me to execute a golden belt, which I enriched with gems and delicate masks and other fancies. The Duke came frequently into the wardrobe, and took great pleasure in watching me at work and talking to me. When my health improved, I had clay brought, and took a portrait of His Excellency, considerably larger than life-size, which I modelled while he stayed with me for a pastime. He was highly delighted with this piece, and conceived such a liking for me that he earnestly begged me to take up my working quarters in the palace, selecting rooms large enough for my purpose, and fitting them up with furnaces and all I wanted, for he greatly enjoyed watching the processes of art. I replied that this was impossible. I should not have finished my undertakings in 100 years. The Duchess also treated me with extraordinary graciousness, and would have been pleased if I had worked for her alone, forgetting Perseus and everything besides. I, for my part, while these vain favours were being showered upon me, knew only too well that my perverse and biting fortune could not long delay to send me some fresh calamity, because I kept ever before my eyes the great mistake I had committed while seeking to do a good action. I refer to my affairs in France. The king could not swallow the displeasure he felt at my departure, and yet he wanted me to return, if only this could be brought about without concessions on his part. I thought that I was entirely in the right, and would not bend submissively, because I judged that if I wrote in humble terms, those enemies of mine would say in their French fashion that I had confessed myself to blame, and that certain misdoings with which they wrongfully taxed me were proved true. Therefore I stood upon my honour, and wrote in terms of haughty coldness, which was precisely what those 2 traitors, my apprentices, most heartily desired. In my letters to them I boasted of the distinguished kindness shown me in my own birthplace by a prince and princess, the absolute masters of Florence. Whenever they received one of these dispatches, they went to the king, and besieged his majesty with entreaties for the castle upon the same terms as he had granted it to me. The king, who was a man of great goodness and perspicacity, would never consent to the presumptuous demands of those scoundrels, since he scented the malignity of their aims. Yet, wishing to keep them in expectation, and to give me the opportunity of coming back, he caused an angry letter to be written to me by his treasurer, Messer Giuliano Bonacorsi, a burgher of Florence. The substance was as follows: if I wanted to preserve the reputation for honesty which I had hitherto enjoyed, it was my plain duty, after leaving France with no cause whatsoever, to render an account of all that I had done and dealt with for his Majesty. The receipt of this letter gave me such pleasure that if I had consulted my own palate I could not have wished for either more or less. I sat down to write an answer, and filled 9 pages of ordinary paper. In this document I described in detail all the works which I had executed, and all the adventures I had gone through while performing them, and all the sums which had been spent upon them. The payments had always been made through 2 notaries and one of his Majesty's treasurers, and I could show receipts from all the men into whose hands they passed, whether for goods supplied or labour rendered. I had not pocketed 1 penny of the money, nor had I received any reward for my completed works. I brought back with me into Italy nothing but some marks of favour and most royal promises, truly worthy of his Majesty. Now, though I cannot vaunt myself of any recompense beyond the salaries appointed for my maintenance in France, 700 golden crowns of which are still due, inasmuch as I abstained from drawing them until I could employ them on my return journey, yet knowing that malicious foes, out of their envious hearts, have played some knavish trick against me, I feel confident that truth will prevail. I take pride in his most Christian Majesty, and am not moved by avarice. I am indeed aware of having performed for him far more than I undertook, and albeit the promised reward has not been given me, my one anxiety is to remain in his Majesty's opinion that man of probity and honour which I have always been. If your Majesty entertains the least doubt upon this point, I will fly to render an account of my conduct, at the risk even of my life. But noticing in what slight esteem I am held, I have had no mind to come back and make an offer of myself, knowing that I shall never lack for bread whithersoever I may go. If, however, I am called for, I will always answer. The letter contained many further particulars worthy of the king's attention, and proper to the preservation of my honour. Before despatching it, I took it to the Duke, who read it with interest. Then I sent it into France, addressed to the Cardinal of Ferrara. Chapter 60. About this time Bernardone Baldini, broker in jewels to the Duke, bought a big diamond from Venice, which weighed more than 35 carats. Antonio, son of Vittorio Landi, was also interested in getting the Duke to purchase it. The stone had been cut with a point, but since it did not yield the purity of lustre which one expects in such a diamond, its owners had cropped the point, and in truth it was not exactly fit for either point or table cutting. Our Duke, who greatly delighted in gems, though he was not a sound judge of them, held out good hopes to the rogue Bernardaccio that he would buy this stone, and the fellow, wanting to secure for himself alone the honour of palming it off upon the Duke of Florence, abstained from taking his partner Antonio Landi into the secret. Now Landi had been my intimate friend from childhood, and when he saw that I enjoyed the Duke's confidence, he called me aside, it was just before noon, at a corner of the Mercato Nuovo, and spoke as follows: "Benvenuto, I am convinced that the Duke will show you a diamond which he seems disposed to buy. You will find it a big stone. Pray assist the purchase. I can give it for 17,000 crowns. I feel sure he will ask your advice, and if you see that he has a mind for it, we will contrive that he secures it." Antonio professed great confidence in being able to complete the bargain for the jewel at that price. In reply, I told him that if my advice was taken, I would speak according to my judgment, without prejudice to the diamond. As I have above related, the Duke came daily into our goldsmith's workshop for several hours, and about a week after this conversation with Antonio Landi, he showed me one day after dinner the diamond in question, which I immediately recognized by its description, both as to form and weight. I have already said that its water was not quite transparent, for which reason it had been cropped. So when I found it of that kind and quality, I felt certainly disinclined to recommend its acquisition. However, I asked his Excellency what he wanted me to say, because it was one thing for jewellers to value a stone after a prince had bought it, and another thing to estimate it with a view to purchase. He replied that he bought it, and that he only wanted my opinion. I did not choose to abstain from hinting what I really thought about the stone. Then he told me to observe the beauty of its great facets. I answered that this feature of the diamond was not so great a beauty as his Excellency supposed, but came from the point having been cropped. At these words my prince, who perceived that I was speaking the truth, made a wry face, and bade me give good heed to valuing the stone, and saying what I thought it worth. I reckoned that since Landi had offered it to me for 17,000 crowns, the Duke might have got it for 15,000 at the highest. So, noticing that he would take it ill if I spoke the truth, I made my mind up to uphold him in his false opinion, and handing back the diamond, said, "You will probably have paid 18,000 crowns." On hearing this, the Duke uttered a loud "Oh!" opening his mouth as wide as a well, and cried out, "Now am I convinced that you understand nothing about the matter." I retorted, "You are certainly in the wrong there, my lord. Do you attend to maintaining the credit of your diamond, while I attend to understanding my trade. But pray tell me at least how much you paid, in order that I might learn to understand it according to the way of your Excellency." The Duke rose, and with a little sort of angry grin, replied, 25,000 crowns and more, Benvenuto, did that stone cost me." Having thus spoken, he departed. Giovan Pagolo and Domenico Poggini, the goldsmiths, were present, and Bachiacca, the embroiderer, who was working in an adjacent room, ran up at the noise. I told them that I should never have advised the Duke to purchase it, but if his heart was set on having it, Antonio Landi had offered me the stone 8 days ago for 17,000 crowns. I think I could have got it for 15,000 or less. But the Duke apparently wishes to maintain his gem in credit, for when Antonio Landi was willing to let it go at that price, how the devil can Bernardone have played off such a shameful trick upon his Excellency? Never imagining that the matter stood precisely as the Duke averred, we laughingly made light of his supposed credulity. Chapter 61. Meanwhile I was advancing with my great statue of Medusa. I had covered the iron skeleton with clay, which I modelled like an anatomical subject, and about half an inch thinner than the bronze would be. This I baked well, and then began to spread on the wax surface, in order to complete the figure to my liking. The Duke, who often came to inspect it, was so anxious lest I should not succeed with the bronze, that he wanted me to call in some master to case it for me. He was continually talking in the highest terms of my acquirements and accomplishments. This made his major domo no less continually eager to devise some trap for making me break my neck. Now his post at court gave him authority with the chief constables and all the officers in the poor unhappy town of Florence. Only to think that a fellow from Prato, our hereditary foeman, the son of a cooper, and the most ignorant creature in existence, should have risen to such a station of influence, merely because he had been the rotten tutor of Cosimo de' Medici before he became Duke. Well, as I have said, he kept ever on the watch to serve me some ill turn, and finding that he could not catch me out on any side, he fell at last upon this plan, which meant mischief. He betook himself to Gambetta, the mother of my apprentice Cencio, and this precious pair together, that knave of a pedant and that rogue of a strumpet, invented a scheme for giving me such a fright as would make me leave Florence in hot haste. Gambetta, yielding to the instinct of her trade, went out, acting under the orders of that mad knavish pedant the major domo. I must add that they had also gained over the Bargello, a Bolognese whom the Duke afterwards dismissed for similar conspiracies. Well, one evening after sunset, Gambetta came to my house with her son, and told me she had kept him several days indoors for my welfare. I answered that there was no reason to keep him shut up on my account, and laughing her whorish arts to scorn, I turned to the boy in her presence, and said these words: "You know, Cencio, whether I have sinned with you." He began to shed tears, and answered, "No." Upon this the mother, shaking her head, cried out at him, "Ugh, you little scoundrel! Do you think I do not know how these things happen?" Then she turned to me and begged me to keep the lad hidden in my house, because the Bargello was after him, and would seize him anywhere outside my house. But there they would not dare to touch him. I made answer that in my house lived my widowed sister and 6 girls of holy life, and that I wanted nobody else there. Upon that she related that the major domo had given orders to the Bargello, and that I should certainly be taken up. Only, if I would not harbour her son, I might square accounts by paying her 100 crowns. The major domo was her crony, and I might rest assured that she could work him to her liking, provided I paid down the 100 crowns. This cousinage goaded me into such a fury that I cried, "Out with you, shameful strumpet! Were it not for my good reputation, and for the innocence of this unhappy boy of yours here, I should long ago have cut your throat with the dagger at my side, and twice or thrice I have already clasped my fingers on the handle." With words to this effect, and many ugly blows to boot, I drove the woman and her son into the street. Chapter 62. When I reflected on the roguery and power of that evil-minded pedant, I judged it best to give a wide berth to his infernal machinations. So early next morning I mounted my horse and took the road for Venice, leaving in my sister's hands jewels and articles to the value of nearly 2,000 crowns. I took with me my servant Bernardino of Mugello, and when I reached Ferrara I wrote word to his Excellency the Duke that though I had gone off without being sent, I should come back again without being called for. On arriving at Venice, and pondering upon the diverse ways my cruel fortune took to torment me, yet at the same time feeling myself none the less sound in health and hearty, I made up my mind to fence with her according to my wont. While thus engrossed in thoughts about my own affairs, I went abroad for pastime through that beautiful and sumptuous city, and paid visits to the admirable painter Titian, and to Jacopo del Sansovino, our able sculptor and architect from Florence. The latter enjoyed an excellent appointment under the Signoria of Venice, and we have been acquainted during our youth in Rome and Florence. These two men of genius received me with marked kindness. The day afterwards I met Messer Lorenzo de' Medici, who took me by the hand at once, giving me the warmest welcome which could be imagined, because we had known each other in Florence when I was coining for Duke Alessandro, and afterwards in Paris while I was in the king's service. At that time he sojourned in the house of Messer Giuliano Buonaccorsi, and having nowhere else to go for pastime without the greatest peril of his life, he used to spend a large part of the day in my house, watching me working at the great pieces I produced there. As I was saying, our former acquaintance led him to take me by the hand and bring me to his dwelling, where I found the Prior degli Strozzi, brother of my Lord Piero. While making good cheer together, they asked me how long I intended to remain in Venice, thinking that I was on my return journey into France. To these gentlemen I replied that I had left Florence on account of the events I have described above, and that I meant to go back after 2 or 3 days, in order to resume my service with the Duke. On hearing this, the Prior and Messer Lorenzo turned round on me with such sternness that I felt extremely uneasy. Then they said to me, "You would do far better to return to France, where you are rich and well known, for if you go back to Florence you will lose all that you have gained in France, and will earn nothing there but annoyances." I made no answer to these words, and departed the next day as secretly as I was able, turning my face again towards Florence. In the meanwhile that infernal plot had come to a head and broken, for I had written to my great master the Duke, giving him a full account of the causes of my escapade to Venice. I went to visit him without any ceremony, and was received with his usual reserve and austerity. Having maintained this attitude a while, he turned toward me pleasantly, and asked where I had been. I answered that my heart had never moved 1 inch from his most illustrious Excellency, although some weighty reasons had forced me to go a-roaming for a little while. Then, softening still more in manner, he began to question me concerning Venice, and after this wise we conversed some space of time. At last he bade me apply myself to business, and complete his Perseus. So I returned home glad and light-hearted, and comforted my family, that is to say, my sister and her 6 daughters. Then I resumed my work, and pushed it forward as briskly as I could. Section 13.
Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 63. The first piece I cast in bronze was that great bust, the portrait of His Excellency, which I had modelled in the goldsmith's workroom while suffering from those pains in my back. It gave much pleasure when it was completed, though my sole object in making it was to obtain experience of clays suitable for bronze casting. I was of course aware that the admirable sculptor Donatello had cast his bronzes with the clay of Florence. Yet it seemed to me that he had met with enormous difficulties in their execution. As I thought that this was due to some fault in the earth, I wanted to make these first experiments before I undertook my Perseus. From them I learned that the clay was good enough, but had not been well understood by Donatello, inasmuch as I could see that his pieces had been cast with the very greatest trouble. Accordingly, as I have described above, I prepared the earth by artificial methods, and found it served me well, and with it I cast the bust, but since I had not yet constructed my own furnace, I employed that of Maestro Zanobi di Pagno, a bell-founder. When I saw that this bust came out sharp and clean, I set at once to construct a little furnace in the workshop erected for me by the Duke, after my own plans and design, in the house which the Duke had given me. No sooner was the furnace ready than I went to work with all diligence upon the casting of Medusa, that is, the woman twisted in the heap beneath the feet of Perseus. It was an extremely difficult task, and I was anxious to observe all the niceties of art which I had learned, so as not to lapse into some error. The first cast I took in my furnace succeeded in the superlative degree, and was so clean that my friends thought I should not need to retouch it. It is true that certain Germans and Frenchmen, who vaunt the possession of marvellous secrets, pretend that they can cast bronzes without retouching them. But this is really nonsense, because the bronze, when it has first been cast, ought to be worked over and beaten in with hammers and chisels, according to the manner of the ancients, and also to that of the moderns. I mean such moderns as have known how to work in bronze. The result of this casting greatly pleased His Excellency, who often came to my house to inspect it, encouraging me by the interest he showed to do my best. The furious envy of Bandinello, however, who kept always whispering in the Duke's ears, had such effect that he made him believe my first successes with a single figure or two proved nothing. I should never be able to put the whole large piece together, since I was new to the craft, and His Excellency ought to take good heed he did not throw his money away. These insinuations operated so efficiently upon the Duke's illustrious ears that part of my allowance for work-people was withdrawn. I felt compelled to complain pretty sharply to His Excellency, and having gone to wait on him one morning in the Via dei Servi, I spoke as follows: "My lord, I do not now receive the moneys necessary for my task, which makes me fear that your Excellency has lost confidence in me. Once more, then, I tell you that I feel quite able to execute this statue 3 times better than the model, as I have before engaged my word." Chapter 64. I could see that this speech made no impression on the Duke, for he kept silence. Then, seized with sudden anger and a vehement emotion, I began again to address him. "My lord, this city of a truth has ever been the school of the most noble talents. Yet, when a man has come to know what he is worth after gaining some acquirements, and wishing to augment the glory of his town and his glorious prince, it is quite right that he should go and labor elsewhere. To prove the truth of these words, I need only remind your Excellency of Donatello and the great Leonardo da Vinci in the past, and of our incomparable Michelangelo Buonarroti in the present. They augment the glory of your Excellency by their genius. I, in my turn, feel the same desire, and hope to play my part like them. Therefore, my lord, give me the leave to go. But beware of letting Bandinello quit you. Rather bestow upon him always more than he demands. For if he goes into foreign parts, his ignorance is so presumptuous that he is just the man to disgrace our most illustrious school. Now grant me my permission, Prince. I ask no further reward for my labours up to this time than the gracious favour of your most illustrious Excellency." When he saw the firmness of my resolution, he turned with some irritation and exclaimed, "Benvenuto! If you want to finish the statue, you shall lack for nothing." Then I thanked him, and said I had no greater desire than to show those envious folk that I had it in me to execute the promised work. When I left His Excellency, I received some slight assistance, but this not being sufficient, I had to put my hand into my own purse in order to push the work forward at something better than a snail's pace. It was my custom to pass the evening in the Duke's wardrobe, where Domenico Poggini and his brother Gian Pagallo were at work upon that golden cup for the Duchess, and the girdle I have already described. His Excellency had also commissioned me to make a little model for a pendant to set the great diamond which Bernardoni and Antonio Landi made him buy. I tried to get out of doing it, but the Duke compelled me by all sorts of kindly pressure to work until 4 hours after nightfall. He kept indeed enticing me to push this job forward by daytime also, but I would not consent, although I felt sure I should incur his anger. Now one evening I happened to arrive rather later than usual, whereupon he said, "How come may you be?" I answered, "My lord, that is not my name. My name is Welcome. But, as I suppose your Excellency is joking, I will add no more." He replied that, far from joking, he meant solemn earnest. I had better look to my conduct, for it had come to his ears that I relied upon his favour to take in first one man and then another. I begged his most illustrious Excellency to name a single person whom I had ever taken in. At this he flew into a rage, and said, "Go, and give back to Bernardone what you have of his. There, I have mentioned one." I said, "My lord, I thank you, and beg you to condescend so far as to listen to 4 words. It is true that he lent me a pair of old scales, 2 anvils, and 3 little hammers, which articles I begged his workman, Giorgio da Cortona, 15 days ago to fetch back. Giorgio came for them himself. If your Excellency can prove, on referring to those who have spoken these calumnies, or to others, that I have ever, from the day of my birth till now, got any single thing by fraud from anybody, be it in Rome or be it in France, then let your Excellency punish me as immoderately as you choose." When the Duke saw me in this mighty passion, he assumed the air of a prudent and benevolent lord, saying, "Those words are not meant for well-doers, therefore, if it is as you say, I shall always receive you with the same kindness as heretofore." To this I answered, "I should like your Excellency to know that the rascalities of Bernardone compel me to ask as a favour how much that big diamond with the crop point cost you. I hope to prove on what account that scoundrel tries to bring me into disgrace." Then his Excellency replied, "I paid 25,000 ducats for it. Why do you ask me?" "Because, my lord, on such a day, at such an hour, in a corner of Mercato Nuovo, Antonio Landi, the son of Vittorio, begged me to induce your Excellency to buy it, and at my first question he asked 16,000 ducats for the diamond. Now your Excellency knows what it has cost you. Domenico Poggini and Gian Pagallo his brother, who are present, will confirm my words, for I spoke to them at once about it, and since that time have never once alluded to the matter, because your Excellency told me I did not understand these things, which made me think you wanted to keep up the credit of your stone. I should like you to know, my lord, that I do understand, and that, as regards my character, I consider myself no less honest than any man who ever lived upon this earth. I shall not try to rob you of 8,000 or 10,000 ducats at one go, but shall rather seek to earn them by my industry. I entered the service of your Excellency as sculptor, goldsmith, and stamper of coin, but to blab about my neighbours' private matters, never. What I am now telling you I say in self-defence. I do not want my fee for information. If I speak out in the presence of so many worthy fellows as are here, it is because I do not wish your Excellency to believe what Bernardone tells you." When he had heard this speech, the Duke rose up in anger, and sent for Bernardone, who was forced to take flight as far as Venice, he and Antonio Landi with him. The latter told me that he had not meant that diamond, but was talking of another stone. So then they went and came again from Venice, whereupon I presented myself to the Duke, and spoke as follows. "My lord, what I told you is the truth, and what Bernardone said about the tools he lent me is a lie. You had better put this to the proof, and I will go at once to the Bargello." The Duke made answer, "Benvenuto, do your best to be an honest man, as you have done until now. You have no cause for apprehension." So the whole matter passed off in smoke, and I heard not one more word about it. I applied myself to finishing his jewel, and when I took it to the Duchess, her Grace said that she esteemed my setting quite as highly as the diamond which Bernardaccio had made them buy. She then desired me to fasten it upon her breast, and handed me a large pin, with which I fixed it, and took my leave in her good favour. Afterwards I was informed that they had the stone reset by a German or some other foreigner. Whether truly or not I cannot vouch, upon Bernardone's suggestion that the diamond would show better in a less elaborate setting. Chapter 65. I believe have already narrated how Domenico and Giovan Pagolo Poggini, goldsmiths and brothers, were at work in the Duke's wardrobe upon some little golden vases, after my design, chased with figures in bas-relief, and other ornaments of great distinction. I oftentimes kept saying to his Excellency, "My lord, if you will undertake to pay some work-people, I am ready to strike coins for your mint and medals with your portrait. I am willing to enter into competition with the ancients, and feel able to surpass them, for since those early days in which I made the medals of Pope Clement, I have learned so much that I can now produce far better pieces of the kind." I think I can also outdo the coins I struck for Duke Alessandro, which are still held in high esteem. In like manner I could make for you large pieces of gold and silver plate, as I did so often for that noble monarch, King Francis of France, thanks to the great conveniences he allowed me, without ever losing time for the execution of colossal statues, or other works of the sculptor's craft. To this suggestion the Duke replied, "Go forward, I will see." But he never supplied me with conveniences, or aid of any kind. One day his most illustrious Excellency handed me several pounds weight of silver, and said, "This is some of the silver from my mines. Take it, and make a fine face." Now, I did not choose to neglect my Perseus, and at the same time I wished to serve the Duke, so I entrusted the metal, together with my designs and models in wax, to a rascal called Piero di Martino, a goldsmith by trade. He set the work up badly, and moreover ceased to labor at it, so that I lost more time than if I had taken it in hand myself. After several months were wasted, and Piero would neither work nor put men to work upon the piece, I made him give it back. I moved heaven and earth to get back the body of the vase, which he had begun badly, as I have already said, together with the remainder of the silver. The Duke, hearing something of these disputes, sent for the vase and the models, and never told me why or wherefore. Suffice it to say that he placed some of my designs in the hands of divers persons at Venice and elsewhere, and was very ill served by them. The Duchess kept urging me to do goldsmith's work for her. I frequently replied that everybody, nay, all Italy knew well I was an excellent goldsmith, but Italy had not yet seen what I could do in sculpture. Among artists certain enraged sculptors laughed at me, and called me the new sculptor. Now I hope to show them that I am an old sculptor, if God shall grant me the boon of finishing my Perseus for that noble piazza of his most illustrious Excellency. After this I shut myself up at home, working day and night, not even showing my face in the palace. I wished, however, to keep myself in favour with the Duchess, so I got some little cups made for her in silver, no larger than 2-penny milk pots, chased with exquisite masks in the rarest antique style. When I took them to her Excellency, she received me most graciously, and repaid the gold and silver I had spent upon them. Then I made my suit to her, and prayed her tell the Duke that I was getting small assistance for so great a work. I begged her also to warn him not to lend so ready an ear to Bandinello's evil tongue, which hindered me from finishing my Perseus. In reply to these lamentable complaints, the Duchess shrugged her shoulders and exclaimed, "Of a surety the Duke ought only too well to know that this Bandinello of his is worth nothing." Chapter 66. I now stayed at home, and went rarely to the palace, labouring with great diligence to complete my statue. I had to pay the workmen out of my own pocket, for the Duke, after giving Lattanzio Gorini orders to discharge their wages at the end of about 18 months, grew tired, and withdrew this subsidy. I asked Lattanzio why he did not pay me as usual. The man replied, gesticulating with those spidery hands of his, in a shrill gnat's voice, "Why do you not finish your work? One thinks that you will never get it done." In a rage I up and answered, "May the plague catch you and all who dare to think I shall not finish it." So I went home with despair at heart to my unlucky Perseus, not without weeping, when I remembered the prosperity I had abandoned in Paris under the patronage of that marvellous King Francis, where I had abundance of all kinds, and here had everything to want for. Many a time I had it in my soul to cast myself away for lost. One day, on one of these occasions, I mounted a nice nag I had, put 100 crowns in my purse, and went to Fiesole to visit a natural son of mine there, who was at nurse with my gossip, the wife of one of my work-people. When I reached the house, I found the boy in good health, and kissed him, very sad at heart. On taking leave he would not let me go, but held me with his little hands, in a tempest of cries and tears. Considering that he was only 2 years old or thereabouts, the child's grief was something wonderful. Now I had resolved in the heart of my despair, if I met Bandinello, who went every evening to a farm of his above San Domenico, that I would hurl him to destruction. So I disengaged myself from my baby, and left the boy there, sobbing his heart out. Taking the road toward Florence, just when I entered the piazza of San Domenico, Bandinello was arriving from the other side. On the instant I decided upon bloodshed, but when I reached the man and raised my eyes, I saw him unarmed, riding a sorry mule, or rather donkey, and he had with him a boy of 10 years old. No sooner did he catch sight of me than he turned the colour of a corpse, and trembled from head to foot. Perceiving at once how base the business would be, I exclaimed, "Fear not, vile coward. I do not condescend to smite you." He looked at me submissively and said nothing. Thereupon I recovered command of my faculties, and thanked God that his goodness had withheld me from so great an act of violence. Then, being delivered from that fiendish fury, my spirits rose, and I said to myself, "If God but grant me to execute my work, I hope by its means to annihilate all my scoundrelly enemies, and thus I shall perform far greater and more glorious revenges than if I had vented my rage upon one single foe." Having this excellent resolve in heart, I reached my home. At the end of 3 days, news was brought me that my only son had been smothered by his nurse, my gossip, which gave me greater grief than I have ever had in my whole life. However, I knelt upon the ground, and not without tears returned thanks to God, as I was wont, exclaiming, "Lord, thou gavest me the child, and thou hast taken him. For all thy dealings I thank thee with my whole heart." This great sorrow went nigh to depriving me of reason, yet, according to my habit, I made a virtue of necessity, and adapted myself to circumstances as well as I was able. End of section 13.
Chapter 14 of Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 14, Chapters 67 through 72. Chapter 67. About this time, a young fellow named Francesco, the son of a smith, Matteo, left Bandinello's employment and inquired whether I would give him work. I agreed, and sent him to retouch my Medusa, which had been new, cast in bronze. After a fortnight, he mentioned that he had been speaking with his master, that is, Bandinello, who told him if I cared to make a marble statue, he would give me a fine block of stone. I replied at once, "Tell him I accept his offer. Perhaps this marble will prove a stumbling block to him, for he keeps on provoking me, and does not bear in mind the great peril he ran upon the piazza of San Domenico. Tell him I will have the marble by all means. I never speak about him, and the beast is perpetually causing me annoyance. I verily believe you came to work here at his orders for the mere purpose of spying upon me. Go then, and tell him I insist on having the marble, even against his will. See that you do not come back without it." Chapter 68. Many days had elapsed during which I had not shown my face in the palace, when the fancy took me to go there one morning just as the Duke was finishing his dinner. From what I heard, His Excellency had been talking of me that morning, commending me highly, and in particular praising my skill in setting jewels. Therefore, when the Duchess saw me, she called for me by Messer Sforza, and on my presenting myself to her most illustrious Excellency, she asked me to set a little point diamond in a ring, saying she wished always to wear it. At the same time she gave me the measure and the stone, which was worth about 100 crowns, begging me to be quick about the work. Upon this the Duke began speaking to the Duchess and said, "There is no doubt that Benvenuto was formerly without his peer in this art, but now that he has abandoned it, I believe it will be too much trouble for him to make a little ring of the sort you want. I pray you, therefore,
not to importune him about this trifle, which would be no trifle to him owing to his want of practice. I thanked the Duke for his kind words, but begged him to let me render this trifling service to the Duchess. Then I took the ring in hand and finished it within a few days. It was meant for the little finger. Accordingly, I fashioned 4 tiny children in the round and 4 masks, which figures composed the hoop. I also found room for some enamelled fruits and connecting links, so that the stone and setting went uncommonly well together. Then I took it to the Duchess, who told me graciously that I had produced a very fine piece, and that she would remember me. She afterwards sent the ring as a present to King Philip, and from that time forward kept charging me with commissions, so kindly, however, that I did my best to serve her, although I saw but very little of her money. God knows I had great need of that, for I was eager to finish my Perseus, and had engaged some journeymen, whom I paid out of my own purse. I now began to show myself more often than I had recently been doing. Chapter 69. It happened on one feast day that I went to the palace after dinner, and when I reached the clock room I saw the door of the wardrobe standing open. As I drew nigh it, the Duke called me, and after a friendly greeting said, "You are welcome. Look at that box which has been sent me by my lord Stefano of Palestrina. Open it, and let us see what it contains." When I had opened the box, I cried to the Duke. The Duke was highly delighted to find the statue so beautiful, and put me a multitude of questions, saying, "Tell me, Benvenuto, minutely, in what consists the skill of this old master, which so excites your admiration?" I then attempted, as well as I was able, to explain the beauty of workmanship, the consummate science, and the rare manner displayed by the fragment. I spoke long upon these topics, and with the greater pleasure because I saw that His Excellency was deeply interested. Chapter 70. While I was thus pleasantly engaged in entertaining the Duke, a page happened to leave the wardrobe, and at the same moment Bandinello entered. When the Duke saw him, his countenance contracted, and he asked him dryly, "What are you about here?" Bandinello, without answering, cast a glance upon the box where the statue lay uncovered. Then, breaking into one of his malignant laughs and wagging his head, he turned to the Duke and said, "My lord, this exactly illustrates the truth of what I have so often told your Excellency. You must know that the ancients were wholly ignorant of anatomy, and therefore their works abound in mistakes." I kept silence, and paid no heed to what he was saying. Nay, indeed, I had turned my back on him. But when the brute had brought his disagreeable babble to an end, the Duke exclaimed, "O Benvenuto, this is the exact opposite of what you were just now demonstrating with so many excellent arguments. Come and speak a word in defence of the statue." In reply to this appeal, so kindly made me by the Duke, I spoke as follows: "My lord, your most illustrious Excellency must please to know that Baccio Bandinello is made up of everything bad, and thus has he ever been. Therefore, whatever he looks at, be the thing superlatively excellent, becomes in his ungracious eyes as bad as can be. I, who incline to the good only, discern the truth with purer sense. Consequently, what I told your Excellency about this lovely statue is mere simple truth, whereas what Bandinello said is but a portion of the evil out of which he is composed." The Duke listened with much amusement, but Bandinello writhed and made the most ugly faces, his face itself being by nature hideous beyond measure, which could be imagined by the mind of man. The Duke at this point moved away and proceeded through some ground floor rooms, while Bandinello followed. The chamberlains twitched me by the mantle and sent me after. So we all attended the Duke until he reached a certain chamber, where he seated himself, with Bandinello and me standing at his right hand and his left. I kept silence, and the gentlemen of His Excellency's suite looked hard at Bandinello, tittering among themselves about the speech I had made in the room above. So then Bandinello again began to chatter, and cried out, "Prince, when I uncovered my Hercules and Cacus, I verily believe 100 sonnets were written on me, full of the worst abuse which could be invented by the ignorant rabble." I rejoined, "Prince, when Michel Agnolo Buonarroti displayed his sacristy to view, with so many fine statues in it, the men of talent in our admirable school of Florence, always appreciative of truth and goodness, published more than 100 sonnets, each vying with his neighbour to extol these masterpieces to the skies. So then, just as Bandinello's work deserved all the evil which, he tells us, was then said about it, Buonarroti's deserved the enthusiastic praise which was bestowed upon it." These words of mine made Bandinello burst with fury. He turned on me and cried: "And you, what have you got to say against my work?" "I will tell you if you have the patience to hear me out." "Go along then," he replied. The Duke and his attendants prepared themselves to listen. I began and opened my oration thus: "You must know that it pains me to point out the faults of your statue. I shall not, however, utter my own sentiments, but shall recapitulate what our most virtuous school of Florence says about it." The brutal fellow kept making disagreeable remarks and gesticulating with his hands and feet, until he enraged me so that I began again, and spoke far more rudely than I should otherwise have done if he had behaved with decency. "Well then, this virtuous school says that if one were to shave the hair of your Hercules, there would be not skull enough left to hold his brain. It says that it is impossible to distinguish whether his features are those of a man or of something between a lion and an ox. The face, too, is turned away from the action of the figure, and is so badly set upon the neck, with such poverty of art and so ill a grace, that nothing worse was ever seen. His sprawling shoulders are like the two pommels of an ass's pack saddle. His breasts and all the muscles of the body are not portrayed from a man, but from a big sack full of melons, set upright against a wall. The loins seem to be modelled from a bag of lanky pumpkins. Nobody can tell how his 2 legs are attached to that vile trunk. It is impossible to say on which leg he stands, or which he uses to exert his strength. Nor does he seem to be resting upon both, as sculptors who know something of their art have occasionally set the figure. It is obvious that the body is leaning forward more than 1/3 of a cubit, which alone is the greatest and most insupportable fault committed by vulgar, commonplace pretenders. Concerning the arms, they say that these are both stretched out without one touch of grace or one real spark of artistic talents, just as if you had never seen a naked model. Again, the right leg of Hercules and that of Cacus have got one mass of flesh between them, so that if they were to be separated, not only one of them, but both together, would be left without a calf at the point where they are touching. They say, too, that Hercules has one of his feet underground, while the other seems to be resting on hot coals." Chapter 71. The fellow could not stand quiet to hear the damning errors of his Cacus in their turn enumerated. For one thing I was telling the truth; for another I was unmasking him to the Duke and all the people present, who showed by face and gesture first their surprise, and next their conviction that what I said was true. All at once he burst out: "Ah, you slanderous tongue! Why don't you speak about my design?" I retorted: "A good draughtsman can never produce bad works. Therefore I am inclined to believe that your drawing is no better than your statues." When he saw the amused expression on the Duke's face, and the cutting gestures of the bystanders, he let his insolence get the better of him, and turned to me with that most hideous face of his, screaming aloud: "Oh, hold your tongue, you ugly!" At these words the Duke frowned, and the others pursed their lips up and looked with knitted brows toward him. The horrible affront half maddened me with fury, but in a moment I recovered presence of mind enough to turn it off with a jest. "You madman, you exceed the bounds of decency. Yet would to God that I understood so noble an art as you allude to. They say that Jove used it with Ganymede in paradise, and here upon this earth it is practised by some of the greatest emperors and kings. I, however, am but a poor humble creature, who neither have the power nor the intelligence to perplex my wits with anything so admirable." When I had finished this speech, the Duke and his attendants could control themselves no longer, but broke into such shouts of laughter that one never heard the like. You must know, gentle readers, that though I put on this appearance of pleasantry, my heart was bursting in my body to think that a fellow, the foulest villain who ever breathed, should have dared in the presence of so great a prince to cast an insult of that atrocious nature in my teeth. But you must also know that he insulted the Duke and not me. For had I not stood in that august presence, I should have felled him dead to earth. When the dirty, stupid scoundrel observed that those gentlemen kept on laughing, he tried to change the subject, and divert them from deriding him, so he began as follows: "This fellow Benvenuto goes about boasting that I have promised him a piece of marble." I took him up at once. "What? Did you not send to tell me by your journeyman Francesco that if I wished to work in marble you would give me a block? I accepted it, and mean to have it." He retorted, "Be very well assured that you will never get it." Still smarting as I was under the calumnious insults he had flung at me, I lost my self-control, forgot I was in the presence of the Duke, and called out in a storm of fury: "I swear to you that if you do not send the marble to my house, you had better look out for another world, for if you stay upon this earth I will most certainly rip the wind out of your carcass." Then, suddenly awaking to the fact that I was standing in the presence of so great a duke, I turned submissively to His Excellency and said: "My lord, one fool makes 100. The follies of this man have blinded me for a moment to the glory of your most illustrious Excellency and to myself. I humbly crave your pardon." Then the Duke said to Bandinello: "Is it true that you promised him the marble?" He replied that it was true. Upon this the Duke addressed me: "Go to the opera, and choose a piece according to your taste." I demurred that the man had promised to send it home to me. The words that passed between us were awful, and I refused to take the stone in any other way. Next morning a piece of marble was brought to my house. On asking who had sent it, they told me it was Bandinello, and that this was the very block which he had promised. Chapter 72. I had it brought at once into my studio, and began to chisel it. While I was rough-hewing the block, I made a model, but my eagerness to work in marble was so strong that I had not patience to finish the model as correctly as this art demands. I soon noticed that the stone rang false beneath my strokes, which made me oftentimes repent commencing on it. Yet I got what I could out of the piece, that is, the Apollo and Hyacinth, which may still be seen and finished in my workshop. While I was thus engaged, the Duke came to my house, and often said to me: "Leave your bronze a while, and let me watch you working on the marble." Then I took chisel and mallet, and went at it blithely. He asked about the model I had made for my statue, to which I answered: "Duke, this marble is all cracked, but I shall carve something from it in spite of that. Therefore I have not been able to settle the model, but shall go on doing the best I can." His Excellency sent to Rome post haste for a block of Greek marble, in order that I might restore his antique Ganymede, which was the cause of that dispute with Bandinello. When it arrived, I thought it a sin to cut it up for the head and arms and other bits wanting in the Ganymede, so I provided myself with another piece of stone, and reserved the Greek marble for a Narcissus which I modelled on a small scale in wax. I found that the block had 2 holes, penetrating to the depth of 1/4 of a cubit, and 2 good inches wide. This led me to choose the attitude which may be noticed in my statue, avoiding the holes and keeping my figure free from them. But rain had fallen scores of years upon the stone, filtering so deeply from the holes into its substance that the marble was decayed. Of this I had full proof at the time of a great inundation of the Arno, when the river rose to the height of more than 1.5 cubits in my workshop. Now the Narcissus stood upon a square of wood, and the water overturned it, causing the statue to break in two above the breasts. I had to join the pieces, and in order that the line of breakage might not be observed, I wreathed that garland of flowers round it which may still be seen upon the bosom. I went on working at the surface, employing some hours before sunrise, or now and then on feast days, so as not to lose the time I needed for my Perseus. It so happened on one of those mornings, while I was still getting some little chisels into trim to work on the Narcissus, that a very fine splinter of steel flew into my right eye, and embedded itself so deeply in the pupil that it could not be extracted. I thought for certain I must lose the sight of that eye. After some days, I sent for Maestro Raffaello de Pili, the surgeon, who obtained a couple of live pigeons, and, placing me upon my back across a table, took the birds and opened a large vein they have beneath the wing, so that the blood gushed out into my eye. I felt immediately relieved, and in the space of 2 days the splinter came away, and I remained with my eyesight greatly improved. Against the feast of Santa Lucia, which came around in 3 days, I made a golden eye out of a French crown, and had it presented at her shrine by one of my 6 nieces, daughters of my sister Liperata. The girl was 10 years of age, and in her company I returned thanks to God and Santa Lucia. For some while afterwards I did not work at the Narcissus, but pushed my Perseus forward under all the difficulties I have described. It was my purpose to finish it, and then to bid farewell to Florence. End of section 14.
Of Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Part 2, Section 15, Chapters 73 through 77. Chapter 73. Having succeeded so well with the cast of the Medusa, I had great hope of bringing my Perseus through, for I had laid the wax on, and felt confident that it would come out in bronze as perfectly as the Medusa. The waxen model produced so fine an effect that when the Duke saw it and was struck with its beauty, whether somebody had persuaded him it could not be carried out with the same finish in metal, or whether he thought so for himself, he came to visit me more frequently than usual, and on one occasion said, "Benvenuto, this figure cannot succeed in bronze. The laws of art do not admit of it." These words of His Excellency stung me so sharply that I answered, "My lord, I know how very little confidence you have in me, and I believe the reason of this is that your most illustrious Excellency lends too ready an ear to my calumniators, or else, indeed, that you do not understand my art." He hardly let me close the sentence when he broke in, "I profess myself a connoisseur, and understand it very well indeed." I replied, "Yes, like a prince, not like an artist, for if your Excellency understood my trade as well as you imagine, you would trust me on the proofs I have already given. These are, first, the colossal bronze bust of your Excellency, which is now in Elba; secondly, the restoration of the Ganymede in marble, which offered so many difficulties and cost me so much trouble that I would rather have made the whole statue new from the beginning; thirdly, the Medusa, cast by me in bronze here now, before your Excellency's eyes, the execution of which was a greater triumph of strength and skill than any of my predecessors in this fiendish art have yet achieved. Look you, my lord, I constructed that furnace anew, on principles quite different from those of other founders. In addition to many technical improvements and ingenious devices, I supplied it with 2 issues for the metal, because this difficult and twisted figure could not otherwise have come out perfect. It is only owing to my intelligent insight into means and appliances that the statue turned out as it did, a triumph judged impossible by all the practitioners of this art. I should like you furthermore to be aware, my lord, for certain, that the sole reason why I succeeded with all those great arduous works in France under the most admirable Majesty King Francis, was the high courage which that good monarch put into my heart by the liberal allowances he made me, and the multitude of work people he left at my disposal. I could have as many as I asked for, and employed at times above 40, all chosen by myself. These were the causes of my having there produced so many masterpieces in so short a space of time. Now then, my lord, put trust in me, supply me with the aid I need. I am confident of being able to complete a work which will delight your soul. But if your Excellency goes on disheartening me, and does not advance me the assistance which is absolutely required, neither I nor any man alive upon this earth can hope to achieve the slightest thing of value. Chapter 74. It was as much as the Duke could do to stand by and listen to my pleadings. He kept turning first this way and then that, while I, in despair, poor wretched I, was calling up remembrance of the noble state I held in France, to the great sorrow of my soul. All at once he cried, "Come, tell me, Benvenuto, how is it possible that yonder splendid head of Medusa, so high up there in the grasp of Perseus, should ever come out perfect?" I replied upon the instant, "Look you now, my lord, if your Excellency possessed that knowledge of the craft which you affirm you have, you would not fear one moment for the splendid head you speak of. There is good reason, on the other hand, to feel uneasy about this right foot, so far below and at a distance from the rest." When he heard these words, the Duke turned, half in anger, to some gentlemen in waiting, and exclaimed, "I verily believe that this Benvenuto prides himself on contradicting everything one says." Then he faced round to me with a touch of mockery, upon which his attendants did the like, and began to speak as follows: "I will listen patiently to any argument you can possibly produce in explanation of your statement, which may convince me of its probability." I said in answer, "I will adduce so sound an argument that your Excellency shall perceive the full force of it." So I began: "You must know, my lord, that the nature of fire is to ascend, and therefore I promise you that Medusa's head will come out famously. But since it is not in the nature of fire to descend, and I must force it downwards 6 cubits by artificial means, I assure your Excellency, upon this most convincing ground of proof, that the foot cannot possibly come out. It will, however, be quite easy for me to restore it." "Why, then," said the Duke, "did you not devise it so that the foot should come out as well as you affirm the head will?" I answered, "I must have a much larger furnace, with a conduit as thick as my leg, so I might have forced the molten metal by its own weight to descend so far. Now, my pipe, which runs 6 cubits to the statue's foot, as I have said, is not thicker than 2 fingers. However, it was not worth the trouble and expense to make a larger, for I shall easily be able to mend what is lacking. But when my mold is more than half full, as I expect, from this middle point upwards, the fire ascending by its natural property, then the heads of Perseus and Medusa will come out admirably, you may be quite sure of it." After I had thus expounded these convincing arguments, together with many more of the same kind, which it would be tedious to set down here, the Duke shook his head and departed without further ceremony. Chapter 75. Abandoned thus to my own resources, I took new courage, and banished the sad thoughts which kept recurring to my mind, making me often weep bitter tears of repentance for having left France, for though I did so only to revisit Florence, my sweet birthplace, in order that I might charitably succor my 6 nieces, this good action, as I well perceived, had been the beginning of my great misfortune. Nevertheless, I felt convinced that when my Perseus was accomplished, all these trials would be turned to high felicity and glorious well-being. Accordingly, I strengthened my heart, and with all the forces of my body and my purse, employing what little money still remained to me, I set to work. First, I provided myself with several loads of pine wood from the forests of Serristori, in the neighborhood of Montelupo. While these were on their way, I clothed my Perseus with the clay which I had prepared many months beforehand, in order that it might be duly seasoned. After making its clay tunic, for that is the term used in this art, and properly arming it and fencing it with iron girders, I began to draw the wax out by means of a slow fire. This melted and issued through numerous air vents I had made, for the more there are of these, the better will the mold fill. When I had finished drawing off the wax, I constructed a funnel-shaped furnace all around the model of my Perseus. It was built of bricks, so interlaced the one above the other that numerous apertures were left for the fire to exhale at. Then I began to lay on wood by degrees, and kept it burning 2 whole days and nights. At length, when all the wax was gone, and the mold was well baked, I set to work at digging the pit in which to sink it. This I performed with scrupulous regard to all the rules of art. When I had finished that part of my work, I raised the mold, by windlasses and stout ropes, to a perpendicular position, and suspending it with the greatest care 1 cubit above the level of the furnace, so that it hung exactly above the middle of the pit, I next lowered it gently down into the very bottom of the furnace, and had it firmly placed with every possible precaution for its safety. When this delicate operation was accomplished, I began to bank it up with the earth I had excavated, and ever as the earth grew higher, I introduced its proper air vents, which were little tubes of earthenware, such as folk use for drains and such like purposes. At length I felt sure that it was admirably fixed, and that the filling in of the pit and the placing of the air vents had been properly performed. I also could see that my workpeople understood my method, which differed very considerably from that of all the other masters in the trade. Feeling confident then that I could rely upon them, I next turned to my furnace, which I had filled with numerous pigs of copper and other bronze stuff. The pieces were piled according to the laws of art, that is to say, resting one upon the other that the flames could play freely through them, in order that the metal might heat and liquefy the sooner. At last I called out heartily to set the furnace going. The logs of pine were heaped in, and what with the unctuous resin of the wood and the good draught I had given, my furnace worked so well that I was obliged to rush from side to side to keep it going. The labor was more than I could stand, yet I forced myself to strain every nerve and muscle. To increase my anxieties, the workshop took fire, and we were afraid lest the roof should fall upon our heads, while from the garden such a storm of wind and rain kept blowing in, that it perceptibly cooled the furnace. Battling thus with all these untoward circumstances for several hours, and exerting myself beyond even the measure of my powerful constitution, I could at last bear up no longer, and a sudden fever, of the utmost possible intensity, attacked me. I felt absolutely obliged to go and fling myself upon my bed. Sorely against my will, having to drag myself away from the spot, I turned to my assistants, about 10 or more in all, what with master founders, hand workers, country fellows, and my own special journeyman, among whom was Bernardino Manolini of Mugello, my apprentice through several years. To him in particular I spoke: "Look, my dear Bernardino, that you observe the rules which I have taught you. Do your best with all dispatch, for the metal will soon be fused. You cannot go wrong. These honest men will get the channels ready. You will easily be able to drive back the 2 plugs with this pair of iron crooks, and I am sure that my mold will fill miraculously. I feel more ill than I ever did in all my life, and verily believe that it will kill me before a few hours are over. Thus, with despair at heart, I left them and betook myself to bed. Chapter 76. No sooner had I got to bed than I ordered my serving maids to carry food and wine for all the men into the workshop. At the same time I cried, "I shall not be alive tomorrow." They tried to encourage me, arguing that my illness would pass over, since it came from excessive fatigue. In this way I spent 2 hours battling with the fever, which steadily increased, and calling out continually, "I feel that I am dying." My housekeeper, who was named Montefiore da Castel del Rio, a very notable manager and no less warm-hearted, kept chiding me for my discouragement. But on the other hand, she paid me every kind attention which was possible. However, the sight of my physical pain and moral dejection so affected her that, in spite of that brave heart of hers, she could not refrain from shedding tears, and yet, so far as she was able, she took good care I should not see them. While I was thus terribly afflicted, I beheld the figure of a man enter my chamber, twisted in his body into the form of a capital S. He raised a lamentable, doleful voice, like one who announces their last hour to men condemned to die upon the scaffold, and spoke these words: "Oh, Benvenuto, your statue is spoiled, and there is no hope whatever of saving it." No sooner had I heard the shriek of that wretch than I gave a howl which might have been heard from the sphere of flame. Jumping from my bed, I seized my clothes and began to dress. The maids and my lads and everyone who came around to help me got kicks or blows of the fist, while I kept crying out in lamentation, "Ah, traitors, enviers, this is an act of treason done by malice prepense. But I swear by God that I will sift it to the bottom, and before I die will leave such witness to the world of what I can do as shall make a score of mortals marvel." When I had got my clothes on, I strode with soul bent on mischief toward the workshop. There I beheld the men whom I had left erewhile in such high spirits, standing stupefied and downcast. I began at once and spoke: "Up with you, attend to me. Since you have not been able or willing to obey the directions I gave you, obey me now, that I am with you to conduct my work in person. Let no one contradict me, for in cases like this we need the aid of hand and hearing, not of advice." When I had uttered these words, a certain maestro, Alessandro Lastricati, broke silence and said: "Look you, Benvenuto, you are going to attempt an enterprise which the laws of art do not sanction, and which cannot succeed." I turned upon him with such fury and so full of mischief that he and all the rest of them exclaimed with one voice: "On then, give orders. We will obey your least commands, so long as life is left in us." I believe they spoke thus feelingly because they thought I must fall shortly dead upon the ground. I went immediately to inspect the furnace, and found that the metal was all curdled, an accident which we express by being caked. I told 2 of the hands to cross the road and fetch from the house of the butcher Capretta a load of young oak wood which had lain dry for above a year. This wood had been previously offered me by Madame Ginevra, wife of the said Capretta. So soon as the first armfuls arrived, I began to fill the grate beneath the furnace. Now, oak wood of that kind heats more powerfully than any other sort of tree, and for this reason, where a slow fire is wanted, as in the case of gun foundry, alder or pine is preferred. Accordingly, when the logs took fire, oh, how the cake began to stir beneath that awful heat, to glow and sparkle in a blaze. At the same time I kept stirring up the channels, and sent men upon the roof to stop the conflagration, which had gathered force from the increased combustion in the furnace. Also, I caused boards, carpets, and other hangings to be set up against the garden, in order to protect us from the violence of the rain. Chapter 77. When I had thus provided against these several disasters, I roared out first to one man and then to another, "Bring this thing here, take that thing there." At this crisis, when the whole gang saw the cake was on the point of melting, they did my bidding, each fellow working with the strength of 3. I then ordered half a pig of pewter to be brought, which weighed about 60 pounds, and flung it into the middle of the cake inside the furnace. By this means, and by piling on wood and stirring, now with pokers and now with iron rods, the curdled mass rapidly began to liquefy. Then, knowing I had brought the dead to life again, against the firm opinion of those ignoramuses, I felt such vigor fill my veins that all those pains of fever, all those fears of death, were quite forgotten. All of a sudden an explosion took place, attended by a tremendous flash of flame, as though a thunderbolt had formed and been discharged amongst us. Unwonted and appalling terror astonished everyone, and me more even than the rest. When the din was over and the dazzling light extinguished, we began to look each other in the face. Then I discovered that the cap of the furnace had blown up, and the bronze was bubbling over from its source beneath. So I had the mouths of my mold immediately opened, and at the same time drove in the 2 plugs which kept back the molten metal. But I noticed that it did not flow as rapidly as usual, the reason being probably that the fierce heat of the fire we kindled had consumed its base alloy. Accordingly, I sent for all my pewter platters, porringers, and dishes, to the number of some 200 pieces, and had a portion of them cast, one by one, into the channels, the rest into the furnace. This expedient succeeded, and everyone could now perceive that my bronze was in most perfect liquefaction, and my mold was filling, whereupon they all, with heartiness and happy cheer, assisted and obeyed my bidding, while I, now here, now there, helped with my own hands, and cried aloud, "O God, Thou that by Thy immeasurable power didst rise from the dead, and in Thy glory didst ascend to heaven." Even thus, in a moment, my mold was filled, and seeing my work finished, I fell upon my knees, and with all my heart gave thanks to God. After all was over, I turned to a plate of salad on a bench there, and ate with hearty appetite, and drank together with the whole crew. Afterwards I retired to bed, healthy and happy, for it was now 2 hours before morning, and slept as sweetly as though I had never felt a touch of illness. My good housekeeper, without my giving any orders, had prepared a fat capon for my repast, so that when I rose about the hour for breaking fast, she presented herself with a smiling countenance and said, "Oh, is that the man who felt he was dying? Upon my word, I think the blows and kicks you dealt us last night, when you were so enraged, and had that demon in your body as it seemed, must have frightened away your mortal fever. The fever feared that it might catch it too, as we did." All my poor household, relieved in like measure from anxiety and overwhelming labor, went at once to buy earthen vessels, in order to replace the pewter I had cast away. Then we dined together joyfully. Nay, I cannot remember a day in my whole life when I dined with greater gladness or a better appetite. After our meal I received visits from the several men who had assisted me. They exchanged congratulations and thanked God for our success, saying they had learned and seen things done which other masters judged impossible. I too grew somewhat glorious, and deeming I had shown myself a man of talent, indulged a boastful humor. So I thrust my hand into my purse and paid them all to their full satisfaction. That evil fellow, my mortal foe, Monsieur Pier Francesco Ricci, major domo of the Duke, took great pains to find out how the affair had gone. In answer to his questions, the two men whom I suspected of having caked my medal for me said I was no man, but of a certainty some powerful devil, since I had accomplished what no craft of the art could do. Indeed, they did not believe a mere ordinary fiend could work such miracles as I, in other ways, had shown. They exaggerated the whole affair so much, possibly in order to excuse their own part in it, that the major domo wrote an account to the Duke, who was then in Pisa, far more marvelous and full of thrilling incidents than what they had narrated. Section 16